everyone, and thanks for joining us on the Retirement Success in Maine podcast today. I'm Abby Duty, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Ben Smith and Curtis Worcester, the Lucerne Lake and Sebago Lake to my Pleasant Lake. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great, Abby. How are you doing?
Good. So today we're talking about something very near and dear to my heart, and I know a lot of fellow Mainers, right? So the concept of a camp. So to many Mainers and people in, all kinds of places, camp is a special place where they go with their families all seasons to enjoy some, quality family time, maybe spend some time unplugged from technology to kind of get away from the everyday life, right? So this can be by a lake, it can be at a mountain, really any setting can have a camp. And so for many generations, these camps have been in families, and passing them down can be a big legacy and thing that we want to pass on to, our kids and grandkids. So, but oftentimes it isn't quite as simple as just passing it down to future generations. So today we have brought on with us an attorney who specializes in this transition of camp properties. So he has provided estate planning to individuals and integrates his business practice with estate planning to help clients develop a succession plan for their businesses and other properties and assets. He's a shareholder of Perkins, Thompson, and formerly a member of the firm's executive committee. He's been selected by his peers to be included in the best lawyers in America 2007 to 2020 in the field of tax law. So please welcome to the show our guest, Tim Benoit.
Welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Tim. Yeah, it's great to have you here. So we always start out by talking a little bit about you, and so where you came from, kind of your bio. So let's start with, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Burlington, Vermont on a lake called Lake Champlain. And beautiful spot. It reminds me of Portland, or Portland reminds me of it. So I've been lucky to live in two great cities. So.
That's great. So can you talk a little bit about your path towards becoming an attorney? How did you start, and why did you choose law?
Well, I started out to be a teacher.
Interesting.
And I really wanted to do that, but I also was very interested in pre-law. I have a double major in history and political science, and I found myself attracted to political science and how people get along or don't get along, and what are the mechanisms for resolving issues and doing planning. So that's what attracted me to law, and I've been on what we call the transactional side of law. I litigate only if I have to, but I count it as a success if I avoid court, if my clients avoid court. Now, sometimes you can't avoid it, and sometimes you have to, take the bull by the horns and go through the process. But it's an expensive, emotionally wrenching process that people don't fully appreciate until they're in the thick of it and they get large bills. So I've trended towards the transactional side, a lot of planning to avoid disputes. I try to see, where there are tensions and deal with them. So that's
So how did you find Perkins Thompson?
Well, I came out of law school and I went to work for an accounting firm, KPMG, and I worked there for 4 years in their tax department. And my wife would always say to me, "Yeah, I sent you to law school to be an accountant." And so I got some really good experience there. I appreciate what accountants do, and I work closely with them regularly. So after 4 years, and the other thing I found is you can't go skiing when you're an accountant because it's tax season, and I love to ski. So those two things, I moved to Perkins Thompson in 1988 and have been here since.
Nice. So can you talk a little bit about Perkins Thompson, kind of their history and what sort of legal services are they best known for, and are you best known for?
So Perkins Thompson was founded in 1871, and
They've been around a while.
they've been around a while. We've historically been a business firm, business law firm. We tend to represent businesses in all facets of their legal needs. So let me just describe a couple of areas. I mean, so I represent a number of companies. Some of them, and a lot of them actually have started from like Guidance Point. I helped Guidance Point start. And these companies have grown into successful companies. And I enjoy watching the growth of and the success of my clients. Not all of them, go anywhere, but the ones that do, it's very enjoyable. So Perkins Thompson's a business law firm. We have practice areas. We have a real estate practice. We know real estate really deeply, and actually it helps me in my practice, particularly about what we're the topic today.
Yes.
We do employment law, and we have startup companies. So again, things that deal with businesses primarily, although I represent a number of individuals in estate planning and the like.
That's great. So you provided kind of the perfect segue into our conversation today about camps, right? And this concept of camp. So here in Maine, how do we define what a camp is? And what do you think camp means? And what do we do at camp?
Well, I don't think camps are camps anymore. Camps are
They're transitioning.
They are expensive lakefront properties.
Yes.
And they weren't always that way. I mean, I know some families that, have had a camp on Lake Sebago for many generations. And it was, they'd drive up on a summer afternoon and enjoy the property. But that property right now is worth a couple of $1 million.
Yes.
And which leads to one of the problems, which is, camps are expensive, not only to buy, they're also expensive to maintain. There are high annual costs like real estate taxes and the like. So, camp is, in my area of law, they're now referred to as legacy properties.
Interesting. It's quite a transition from the traditional camp that we think of.
Up to camp. So,
yeah, exactly.
And Tim, from our side is, many times when we sit down with a client and you're discussing the financial plan and assets and things come up, and because you're trying to tie those assets and the financial resources to those goals, right? And sometimes it's, well, not just spending my assets over time, but also when I pass, what do I want to do with these assets and where does it go? And which is why I think when it comes to estate planning and things like that, we call up people like yourself is, hey, we need someone to help kind of draft these sorts of documents. So the concept, I know we just introduced the idea of a legacy asset, but, legacy goals on the other side is, how do I make sure that these assets go through for future generations? So that comes up a lot around that asset of a family camp. And as Abby kind of said in the introduction, there's a lot of this emotional feeling here because, all those warm kind of feelings of my family has come here. I have friends from away that, they all come to Maine in the summer because that's the great destination to be and relax and hang out. All this really warm, fun, emotional things. And they say, that's what I want to give to my kids, and I want to give it to their kids. So this whole idea of preserving the family camp is something there. So what is it that you are seeing? I know I described what we see on our end, but what do you see that people are really emotionally attached to? And why is it the camp that kind of does it for them?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a place for families to gather, and people have really good memories of themselves, their children, their grandchildren, all enjoying this space, and it is a warm, fuzzy, good emotion. But on the other hand, I also see really negative emotions when things go south. They don't work as well. But I want to say one thing about sometimes, and I find this a lot, the parents have what I call a notion that kids are going to they're just going to love this camp. They're going to want it. The big change I would say, in the last 30, 40 years is families they're all over the country now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that is a factor to take into account. And so, it's just hard to get everybody together.
Mm-hmm.
So the parents might have an unrealistic notion about how this property will work. And Ben, actually, you and I had a client where I met with them, and they really wanted to give this lovely property to their kids. And I kept asking them hard questions and encourage them to talk to their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And after they talked to their kids, it was clear that the kids didn't want the property.
Mm-hmm.
So why go through all the hoops, right? Why do all the work?
Well,
right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and so I do try to identify issues. And in that case, it was a lovely property, but both families lived in Maine. The kids and their families lived in Maine. They had other places. They did still gather, but this particular property was not at the same emotional appeal as it was to the parents. So, I've just got to work my way through the fog of those emotions to really get at what's going to work.
Mm. So Tim, I know we just that story you shared, resulted in a ingredient, if you will, that didn't necessarily work for these parents that wanted to leave this camp to their children. Can we just talk about the flip side is, we hear these people have this dream of leaving this camp for generations and generations, and just what has to go right in that process. And I'm sure based on the conversation we just had, part of it is the intended receivers of the property need to want it. I'm assuming that's ingredient one or one of the ingredients. But can you just talk about the process in general and what really has to go right for it to work?
Well, what really has to go right is good communication. And, sometimes uncomfortable conversations. I'll share a story that basically the mother and father were going to give the camp originally to the daughter, and then they changed their mind. They wanted to have it co-owned by brother and sister. Or actually, I take that back. They wanted it owned by brother, and daughter basically told them, if you give him that camp, I will sue him.
Oh.
Wow.
It was, talk about strong emotions.
Yeah.
But the point of that was she communicated to her parents that this was really important. Now, she could have communicated it differently, but you still got the message.
Yeah.
So that's what I try to do, is just figure out what's important to whom, and also be realistic.
Mm-hmm.
A big piece of that is, do people appreciate what it takes to own and maintain, real property on a lake,
Sure,
or the ocean?
Yeah. And Tim, follow up to that is, because I know what you just expressed was, hey, here's, let's use that example, is here's the parents communicating to the daughter and the son about maybe what they want to do. And I guess what I could see a lot is, and what we see with estate planning is sometimes parents change their minds. They have different attitudes about, well, I thought it was going to be this way, but this came up, and for that reason, I don't think that's going to work anymore. Now I want to do something else. So you could also see where there's kind of this fine line of under communicating, which then people are in the dark and they don't know what's going to happen with things. But then you over communicate, is maybe I expressed to the daughter, oh, this is totally yours one day, right? This is going to be your thing. And she's all, her heart's set on it. She's working towards it. And for whatever reason, the parents might change their mind. Maybe they over communicate, they communicate that change to somebody else. Right. So couldn't you see where obviously that communication is tough as well to kind of migrate or navigate between these dynamics as well?
It is. And I'm finding, or I've found, that the generation that now is, in their 80s and 90s grew up in a culture where, you didn't talk about these things.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You didn't tell your kids about these things. You just kind of left it. And, that's the worst extreme. The other is, just constantly talking about it and switching and moving things around. I always counsel my clients to try to determine, assess what's important to whom, and gauge interest. And so they're asking questions instead of saying, I'm going to give you the camp. And so that tends to help. And the client that we worked with, that basically they ended up contacting their kids to ask outright, are you interested in this property? So, it's a careful balancing, and all families are different. And this will really work well in some families and just is impossible to work in others. There are too many problems. And so that's what I have to do to help my clients figure out what they want to do with these assets.
So kind of touching on what you just said, the problems that come up with this transition. So, so let's take an example of somebody that has a camp and definitely wants to pass it down to future generations. So what are some common mistakes that you see in preserving the asset, right? So maybe, not maintaining the camp, I don't know. And then what are the biggest errors that people make when they go about trying to start the transition or planning for the transition?
Okay. Well, so if you leave your camp real estate to, say there's 3 kids, it automatically defaults to a property ownership, what we call tenancy in common, which means they all own a 1/3 interest. And that tenancy in common is different from how real estate is owned by a husband and wife, typically, right, of a house or something, where it's called joint tenancy by right of survivor. So the survivor automatically owns 100% if the other person dies. In the case of the kids with tenancies in common, they own 1/3, which will pass down to their kids. And so if they have 2 kids, all of a sudden they have a 6th. And so unless you plan for that, you could end up with, fractional interests with nobody able to control how the property. So that's the first thing I look at. And so I typically do not want real estate to be held as tenants in common. The other bad thing about tenants in common is you have this right of partition. So 2 tenants in common own property and they don't get along. One of them can sue in court for what's called a right of partition. I want to split the property. Well, if the property is not legally, dividable, it then is partitioned by sale. So there are these legal rights, and they're kind of a blunt instrument. And typically, I encourage people to put real estate into a trust or a limited liability company, which gets rid of that right of partition. But then you've got to kind of have a mechanism within those entities that allow for people to resolve disputes. But the way the real estate is structured is probably the first thing that I look at.
And a follow-up to that, Tim, just to get into that a little bit in terms of the partition part. So essentially what I hear you saying is, you have those 3 kids and, that maybe they're kind of saying, hey, I want to split it, and they really can't split it. So they have to then sell their share. So that is essentially forcing a purchase by one of the remainders if they can. If they can't, then it's basically forcing a sale for everybody at that point, right?
Yeah. I mean, in a nutshell, you can't force somebody to buy you out, but you can make their life difficult enough that they will buy you out or sell the property. And that's what the right of partition does. Now, I'll give you an example where I used a right of partition to help my client. So my client was one of 5 children, and this was a property on Moosehead Lake. And so they each had a 20% interest, tenancy in common interest. So my client was able to acquire from 3 of his siblings their 60%. So he ended up owning 80%. He put that 80% into a limited liability company for future planning, but then kept trying to negotiate with the fifth sibling, and this person was passive aggressive at best and just downright nasty at worst. So anyway, that person would just say, you can buy me out for 5 times what you think it's worth. And so it was, like I said, passive aggressive. So based on our advice, the client initiated a partition action to buy that person out. Now, that was a risky proposition, but it ended up working. So a partition action says this land was not dividable, so it had to be by sale. So the 5th sibling, who was in Hungary, we had to hire attorneys in Hungary to serve that person and do all kinds of crazy stuff, but which we did. And so we had a partition action. So all of a sudden this person's faced with, I got to do something. So we had an appraisal. We made an offer to that person to buy them out. The other person didn't have an appraisal. So if we went to court, that person had no evidence about the worth of the property. And so it was likely that my client the court would allow my client to buy the other person or order my client to buy the person out, even if it was against what that other person wanted to do, because they owned 80%, and they made a reasonably fair offer. So the end result of that was a negotiated settlement. Now, the 5th brother got a premium on it, and not that much. It was maybe 5%, but then my client ended up owning 100%, and so that is now in a limited liability company. And I'm actually working on making gifts at the end of this year and the beginning of next year of membership interests in that to that client's children.
Interesting. That's kind of I want to explore that a little bit more a little bit later with you, but I want to ask about and just expand on what Abby asked about the errors people making. And one that I guess I want to just ask your opinion on, it feels like from a legal perspective that there could be times when people are putting these sorts of assets into some sort of legal structure, that maybe it's either too restrictive or maybe too loose on how things work. And so I guess from like almost thinking about like the drafting of the Constitution type thing of, hey, if I want this to work for next generations, you just described over the last 30, 40 years, hey, especially lakefront properties are really gone up in price. Taxes are changing. There's attitudes that are changing from people that might inherit these. So almost I think when you're going through this process with your clients, that if this is something that might happen, that there is a possibility to keep these properties and assets in place for generations, that you're almost wanting to have a flexibility included, but not maybe have it be too flexible that it just causes it to go haywire as well. So what are your thoughts around that? Because I can see where that's a really tough thing to accomplish.
It is. And first of all, I tell my clients that this type of property will not usually survive more than 2 or 3 generations. It just doesn't. Too many interests, because you got it owned by siblings, and then you have it owned by cousins, and then it goes down to, So I tell my clients that up front. So I say, then we have to build in a mechanism to allow one or more of the parties to buy each other out. But the other thing I tell them is, we want to structure this in a way that does not aggravate relationships, sibling relationships. I mean, because that's easy to do, I can tell you. And most of the time it's done by just doing nothing, not talking about it or doing anything. So those are 2 kind of big areas that I see errors arise from.
And Tim, I'll kind of say this too, and I know, again, with the work I've seen you do with some of clients as well, is I think there's always this, I have a stated goal of maybe preserving the asset, but I think there's a under-realized appreciation of that. By putting an asset in the middle of relationships, sometimes it's going to cause friction between relationships. And I think maybe people haven't thought about that a lot, of that, I want to also keep this asset in a place that also minimizes a conflict that might come up in the future, right? Doesn't mean you can avoid it completely, but I don't want to cause people to start fighting either. That may be breaking up my family.
Well, it does. So the big issues are, families all over the country. So that goes to use of the property. Are they going to use it? And then the other issue is, how are they going to share the expenses? And if I never use it and I'm paying, 1/5, 1/4, 1/3 of the expenses, I don't feel good. So those are the areas that I explore.
Is there, in your opinion too, in terms of with an asset like this, like a camp, whatever it might be, it feels like there almost should be some sort of financial resource, like liquid money, that goes along with that in a way, just because, like, hey, in terms of like taxes and things that might come up, if it was more of a self-contained asset as well, maybe that would help.
That's a nice thought.
Okay. Maybe that's my error in thinking.
Does one of the children who lives in California want to see some of their share of the so-called liquid assets go into an endowment for a camp they never use? These are things to think, but your point is a good one. And here's how I approach it. So I analogize it to a condo association. You've got to train your children to manage this property. And I advocate that you have an annual meeting, you have an annual budget, you get everybody to buy into it. You say, here's your share. And then some of these properties are rented, because the family doesn't have the means to, or some of the siblings don't have the means to pay their share. So, and then you're in the business of renting. And so you've got things to think about. So like I said, there's a lot of moving parts, but that's the way I try to get people to think about it.
Gotcha. And I want to ask a question about, okay, so say, you mentioned where you're structuring this asset in an LLC or a trust. And one of the things that you kind of pointed out was, hey, when you start going too many generations, it splinters so many ways. It can cause it really be difficult to continue. So it feels like at some point there's a appropriate time to end the preservation of the camp. Mm-hmm. That there's an exit clause almost that should happen there. So what are the steps to take to really end these structures? And really, I don't want to use maybe it's a very poor neutral term, is to dispose of the camp at that point or liquidate it to the intended heirs. So what are generally the conditions you would need to kind of say, this is the time to end it? And then what do I have to do once that decision's made?
So what I see, because there's no, epiphany about now's the time to end this. Mm-hmm. What usually happens is one or more of the siblings say, I never got there. I don't want to, you got to buy me out. And that precipitates the resolution. Gotcha. Now, these LLC, as I said before, well, first of all, I just want to say I favor LLCs over trusts. Trusts have fiduciary obligations woven into them that gives parties some leverage in negotiations. So I avoid those like the plague. And limited liabilities companies are really creatures of contract. So if everybody's an adult, you agreed, here's what you got to live with. I don't owe you a fiduciary duty and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So the question becomes, if in that scenario where I don't use it, you buy me out, what do I have there that facilitates that? So I have a number of different ways, but the one I seem to be using the most of is what I call put up or shut up, which is, you want to buy me out? I mean, you want me to buy you out? Okay, I'll buy you out, but you're going to take a 25% discount or a 50% discount, and I'll pay you over time. So, and then if nobody wants to buy that person out, the shut up part is the property has to be sold. Mm-hmm. So if there are, say, 3 kids, one of them says, you two have to buy me out. One of the people who want to stay says, I'll buy you out. And so you end up with a 50% membership interest. Well, I know you don't. You end up with a 66 and 2/3 interest and a 1/3 interest, which has its own issues. But you have a resolution at that point. But if in that same 3-member situation, if the other 2 or any one of them doesn't want to buy that person out, the result is it gets sold and the property is split, and nobody gets a discount. They just split the proceeds. So that's my, it seems to be the way that works the best. As long as people go into it with their eyes open, and I can't force you to buy me out at fair market value. I can force you to buy me out at, I get a discount. Then, it seems to work.
So Tim, what I like is, and again, for maybe the audience here that might not be used to the kind of the business sense in terms of ownership and shares and things like that, obviously this is probably a pretty new concept. So I want to ask a little bit more about that real quick on the structure of an LLC. So I put my family camp into an LLC, and we're creating a share structure, right? Maybe right today where me and my spouse own all of those shares today, but based upon my death or our death, then those shares then go to these different places. Is that a function of the will essentially, where here's my assets, or is it a function of the LLC where, there's like a change of almost like the CEO of the organization, there's a change of control upon certain actions?
So an LLC, limited liability company, is you should think of it more like a partnership as opposed to a corporation.
Okay.
You got 50% members, mom and dad. And so what we usually do is people engage in gift giving programs using the $15,000 annual exclusion to avoid having to file gift tax returns. So with 3 children, and I'm doing this right now, each parent can give each one of them an interest worth $15,000, and you calculate what that percentage is, but it's worth $15,000. So you get a real estate broker to give you an appraisal or an estimate of value, and if you get it in like November, you can then make gifts in December for 2020, and then make gifts at the beginning of 2021 using the same appraisal. So mom and dad essentially can give away $120,000 worth of value in that scenario, $60,000 for each year. And that's using one. And so that leads to a bunch of other stuff, when you start giving away things. But that's one of the ways we manage lifetime gifts. I do not want a property to go through probate if I can avoid it. So the LLC interests typically have it their own. The LLC is actually owned by the revocable trusts of mom and dad. And so it avoids probate, it manages itself. Probate, again, provides an opportunity for people to, get a judge involved. And we're trying to avoid that.
Tim, I want to kind of back up a little bit to what Ben's initial question was about. He talked about sort of ending that preservation of a property. And I want to rewind even further than that and say I'm coming to see you, say I own a camp, and I really want to, I have that dream of wanting this camp to stay in my family, whether it's to my kids, then to my grandkids or whoever. Is there a point where, you look at my situation and say it's just not worth it? Like, is that an asset base? So I think about, say my camp's not that nice and it costs a lot to upkeep, or there's a ton of, repairs I have to do. Is there kind of like an arbitrary number or a way you kind of assess values to say, you know what, Curtis, that's just not a good idea to pass that on to someone?
Well, even if a camp is physically not that attractive, if it's on the water, it has value.
Sure.
And it could be torn down and sold. And so it has value. Again, it goes to the communication of talking to your kids. Do they want to use this property? And so there's never, to me, I walk away from it or sell it now kind of thing. In that instance where with Ben, the clients still live there, but on their death, that property would be sold. And the proceeds put in their trust for the benefit of their kids.
So you talked a little bit earlier about how camps have changed, right? So 40 and 50 years ago, a camp was very different than it is today, and what's being passed down is very different. So have the legal structures changed along with the camps themselves, right? So the properties are very different now than they were then. Does the legal structure go along with that?
Well, you didn't have limited liability companies until 1994 in Maine.
Okay.
So that before that, it was pretty much trusts. But as I said before, I tend to avoid trusts now because of, fiduciary obligations.
Right.
Now that's, if they used a trust, they were thinking ahead. Most people just died and the property went through probate, and then within the probate process, you have this asset and other assets, and then there has to be a plan of distribution ultimately of those assets. And that can be a negotiation in and of itself. One person saying, I want the camp, I want the money, and then you gotta, make the sausage. That's what was more typical, I would say 30, 40 years ago.
Are you seeing more and more people put their camps into things like trusts or your preferred method LLCs? Like, is it becoming more common practice because of, bad experiences that they've had dealing with camps being passed down?
Well, I've seen enough bad experiences that I tend to recommend anybody who has this kind of property and they do want to have it passed down. Mm-hmm. I've also seen parents say, we're going to use it for our lifetime, but then we want it sold and the kids can't buy it. And I'm going, really? But I've seen that. And it's all over the place. But what the LLC does, and a trust, the same thing, is it provides a mechanism for managing the property and managing the relationships.
Yes.
So
Tim, in regards to that too, I'm just trying to think about, like, if we kind of have somebody that says that I want to pass this property to future generations, they go through all this work and then they maybe change their mind, right? They say, you know what, 10 years down the road, sons in Arizona, daughters in Alaska, there's no way they're coming to Maine and they're going to enjoy this camp. So they've done all these structures, they've done all this. Is it more difficult to then to sell the camp then if it's in the name of a trust or name of an LLC? Does that complicate that whole transactional process at all?
The mere fact of it being owned by an entity does not complicate it because it can just sell. What complicates it is the relative ownership of the members. Mm. So I've described to you a process by which parents give away percentages. And I had, and I'm having clients right now cross the 50% line, which transfers control to the younger generation. Now we have ways of managing that. We typically, when a senior generation crosses that ownership line, in this case, it is really the objective to give it away, to get it out of their estate. It's a highly appreciating asset. Right. You just get it out of your estate, but I want to use it. That's what they tell me. I want to use it. So when they cross the 50% line, they lose control and it becomes important. But as I said before, the goal is to try to change, to get this out of your estate while still maintaining the right to use it. So we put the parents in a lease where they actually lease the property.
Interesting.
And what they're paying for rent is generally at least the annual operating expenses as a rent. And if they rent it for more, then you're funding a reserve for capital expenses and maintenance. And then you have the parents. So I've got some parents who are now in their late 60s. We're putting them in a lease that has an initial 5-year term with a right to renew for 3 5-year periods. So we've got it out there long enough. But the idea that the parents are renting it is to support the fact that they have, in fact, given it away.
Interesting.
Right.
The IRS can't come back and try to, grab it and say, you never gave it away.
Right. So Tim, I want to ask we've asked about the what and the why and the how and a lot of that, but maybe the thing we haven't really touched on is when, because it feels like what's happening right now is people, then they start addressing their estate planning is this whole, now I'm going to go create an LLC trust structure, something along those lines to then give it away. maybe from a best practice, would it make more sense to maybe just have this structure be up front when we do buy we're buying this camp, we think this is something we're going to love for a period of time, just go ahead and put that into that structure at that point?
Yeah, anytime I have clients that are buying that kind of a property, I recommend they put it in an LLC right away. And if they don't want to give anything away, they just keep it in the LLC. And so it's for management. I mean, they can get old, and you need to have people be able to take over this and not have it run through probate and the like. So,
but this would allow for, hey, this LLC owns this asset. Well, if we go out of this camp and we've relocated to North Carolina and we buy a camp there because it's closer to the grandkids or something, we could essentially just swap out assets into this LLC as we're kind of going, right? Would it only own one piece of asset?
And whether they want to have in that scenario, it's South Carolina LLC or a Maine LLC.
Right. Yes.
Those are kind of the details we think about. The other thing we need to think about is there a mortgage? Because you can't just have an LLC. Because it can trigger, first of all, it can boot you out of the secondary market in the cheapest mortgages.
That's right.
But revocable trusts work there in that instance, because that won't kick you out of the secondary market in the cheapest mortgages. And then at some point in the future, you may transfer the property from the revocable trust to an LLC, of which the revocable trusts, own the LLC. So it depends on the circumstances. So,
are there any things to think about from like a tax perspective from buying things in an LLC versus a revocable trust? Are there any issues that come up there?
Well, so an LLC, if it has more than one member, is a partnership. Mm-hmm. And if you have a lease, you're collecting rent.
Right.
So, but, it's relatively simple. If you're renting it among yourselves and you're just paying, the rent's just paying the expenses, it really isn't a tax issue as if you're renting to third parties. Mm-hmm. Revocable trusts are just, they're ignored. It's like for tax law, they're ignored. Okay. And if it's a single member LLC, same thing. It's just ignored. It doesn't exist for tax purposes. But if you have two members, you've got a partnership, and you may have to find out, you may be filing a tax return, and you get a K-1 that says your share of the income and expenses is this, and it's usually minuscule because nobody's making any money on this.
So Tim, I think I want to make the point here is, we've kind of asked about like scenarios and, different things. Obviously what you've just highlighted is just the fact of just coming and sitting down with somebody like yourself and saying, hey, this is what I have. This is where I'm going with it. And you asking some really good questions of, what about legacy concerns? What are you thinking about? Is this a permanent place you want to be at? Are you going to move from place to place? All those things are really kind of factor into your advice to say, hey, based on this is why this structure would make the more sense, or this is why it's something else, or don't do anything maybe is the option as well.
Doing nothing is always an option.
Yeah.
But it's completely fact-based. Who are the people in front of me, and what are they like, and what are the family like, and do they care about, I've had people say, I don't want that child over there to get a dime. And so I've got to factor that in, and protect their other children from, the person over there who's going to make mischief. So it's all, everyone's different. Every situation's different.
Which is, I think, from an advice perspective, as advice practitioners, all of us on this recording today, it's like, well, that's what you've got to do, right? Is you just sit down, the really good ones, ask really good questions, really do a lot of investigation, do discovery, try to figure out all the pieces to then say, let's put this all together to make the best solution we think is customized to you. So obviously, we have obviously experience with you already, Tim, in lots of different ways, but we see, and that's why we wanted you to have to come on the show today and really explain it, because I think you did a phenomenal job there.
Thank you.
So, Tim, we have reached the final question of this podcast episode. It's a question that we ask every single one of our guests, regardless of the topic of conversation. So, as you know, the name of our show is Retirement Success in Maine Podcast. So we like to ask, and I want to ask you, what is your personal definition of retirement success? And then kind of looking ahead to your own retirement, sort of what will make that, in your eyes, a successful experience for you?
So for others and myself, I think it's the same thing. My view is that it's, you're financially comfortable, and you have the means to do what you would like to do and spend time with your family, and also have a family that's as intact as it can be. And because that doesn't always happen, but with good planning and good communication, it does. So that to me is retirement success, where, the parents are, stopping by and giving, ridiculous gifts to the grandchildren and taking them skiing and doing all that stuff. That's the kind of stuff I see.
Awesome.
That's great. Well, as Ben said, thanks so much for coming on the show, Tim. I think you did a great job. I think it's going to be really useful for a lot of people who have these legacy properties to kind of have a starting off point to think about some things. So thanks again.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks again to Tim Benoit for joining us today. I think it was a really valuable conversation that a lot of people will find really useful, really interesting, and, maybe spark some thoughts about how they can start planning for their properties that they want to pass on. So as we always do at the end of the show, we do a little wrap up of things that we found interesting, our takeaways. So Curtis, do you want to start with what you took away?
Yeah, I think overall the episode in general was super informative. I'll lead with that. But a piece that really stuck out to me was when Tim was talking about, he sees parents that start gifting, portions of the camp to their kids, and he brought up the point of once you hit that 50% line or past the 50% line, because then you're at a point where the kids have control of the property at that point, and
right.
I'll speak kind of in my own situation here. My father has a camp, and if this were to happen there, my dad's only 60 years old, but if we all got by the 50% mark, in theory, it could go bad if, me and my brothers decide to say, hey, Dad, surprise, we're selling the camp. So I thought it was really cool that he brought up the idea of the parents renting, and signing a lease agreement with the kids so they can continue to use their property for the next 30, 40 years, even though they may not have full control of it. So I thought that was a really interesting and super informative, piece that I think people can take away.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's helpful to hear from Tim some of the different ways that they can get around some of these different possible problems of putting it into an LLC and having, ownership then given away.
Yeah.
So I found that very interesting. What about you, Ben?
Yeah, I think the communication part is pretty valuable, and obviously we've had an episode with Amy K. Hutchins about the kind of the power communication and how to have some of these hard conversations. So maybe kind of tandeming these two episodes together, if you're kind of saying, hey, I want to be talking about my camp and what we want to do, because again, I think when we sit down with our clients, the visual in their head is the kids swimming in the water, and the fire pit and the bonfire and the s'mores and the friends playing cards on the deck and, the nice kind of summer air, all of that, right? It's just, it's very romantic. And you go, well, yeah, why wouldn't anybody love this? But in reality, things always can be different, right? And kind of this value of, hey, I'm communicating, if I communicate that to my kids or to who I'm going to gift this to, maybe they don't share that same dream. Maybe what they see when they look at it is, being there every weekend to maintain a property where I already have my house. Maybe it's I have to travel 50 minutes to get to that camp, and that's 2 hours round trip, and I got kids that can't sit still for 50 minutes each way, and that seems like a lot of work. We all can visualize things differently.
Yeah.
And the story that we have in our heads, and I know Amy Kay had that point, is like, a story in my head is, well, a story in your head might not be the story in their head, and for that reason, maybe that's why they don't want to have that camp. So getting to that point of maybe there's one child that does, one child that doesn't. And if you knew that, why go through all the work before, then figure it out and have to undo it and redo it again, which is there's gonna be expense related to that. So all of those things, I think if we have a little bit more communication going on with what we want, you're more apt to get it. And I think that was a pretty valuable lesson from Tim today.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that seems to be a thread through a lot of our conversations, is the importance of communication. And that was, again, just highlighted here. So what I found really interesting was using the structure of an LLC for property planning.
Mm-hmm.
I never really thought of that, right? So normally the default is a trust. And I just found it really interesting and useful, the idea that Tim brought of putting these properties into an LLC, gifting away ownership, is just a really cool way of doing it. And that's one of the reasons why we had Tim on here today, right? So not only does he do estate planning, he also does a lot of work with businesses. So that business side and the LLC side really kind of marry well to give some more unique, different ideas about how to plan to have these legacy properties remain in families. So thanks again to everyone for listening today. Thanks to Tim again and Perkins Thompson. So we'll have some links at the bottom of the blog about Tim and about Perkins Thompson for everyone to check out. The blog is blog.guidancepointllc.com/episode 35. So thanks again for joining us, everyone. We will hope to talk to you soon.